Hello. Yes, I think now it works. Okay, welcome back. I think everybody's here. We will continue now with the second session. That is Bell Beaker Borderlands, Interaction and Transformation in the Central Mediterranean. And we will then start this session with a keynote paper by Stašo Forenbaher, who will talk about the puzzle at the crossroads, Cetina style, culture and phenomenon.
Oops. Well, thank you, Martin, for your announcement. Hello to everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I also hope that I'm not going to put you to sleep after lunch, which happens sometimes. But in any case, I should begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I'm greatly honored to speak here today about the archaeology of a region where I do most of my research. The Eastern Adriatic is one of those regions that lay at the fringe of the vast tracts of Europe, where the third millennium BC was marked by the presence of the bell beakers. In the Eastern Adriatic littoral and its hinterland, the second half of the third millennium BC is routinely referred to as the time of Cetina culture. But where does this term come from, and what exactly does it designate? On this particular occasion, at a conference focusing on the bell beakers, one should also ask, how does Cetina relate to the bell beakers in time, space, and content? To what extent are they similar? Which might be their common traits? And how do they differ from each other? As is often the case, the name Cetina culture is to a large extent an accident of research history. 70 years ago, a number of mounds were made, they were not made then, a number of mounds made of piled up stones were excavated around the source of Cetina River in the Dalmatian hinterland. Those mounds were by no means unique. By one estimate, there may be as many as 100,000 prehistoric mounds scattered around the Eastern Adriatic landscape between Friuli and Albania. The mounds around the source of Cetina originally provoked interest because they were located near an important early medieval church dedicated to the Holy Savior. It was suspected that the mounds in the close neighborhood might contain medieval cemeteries, which prompted their excavation. The mounds, however, contained various artifacts from different prehistoric periods, including a previously unknown kind of attractively decorated pottery. Since then, similar pottery was found at many sites on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea and was occasionally reported from across a wide swath of the central Mediterranean, including southern Italy, western Greece, and Malta. Meanwhile, the contents of what became known as Cetina culture remained poorly defined in its heartland and even less well dated. Most of the available information still comes from old excavations and is incomplete, inconclusive, or questionable. In consequence, the archaeology of Cetina culture is riddled with unresolved issues, controversies, and established facts that are based on problematic evidence. Cetina, first and foremost, is a river. It is one of only a few large rivers that flow into the Adriatic from the northeast. Its source lies at the foot of Mount Dinara at approximately 400 meters above the sea level. From there, Cetina runs across several plateaus and valleys, descends through deep canyons, and after 100 kilometers, it reaches the Adriatic. So, while the distance from the source to the sea is not that great, the intervening terrain is difficult, and one has to cross several mountain ranges in order to reach the coast. The excavations of the mounds around the source of Cetina began in 1953 and were led by Ivan Marovic, a prehistorian from the Archaeological Museum in Split. In the course of several campaigns that stretched over the next 15 years, he excavated a total of 132 mounds at 8 different locations. Some of the mounds contained burials and prehistoric artifacts. Other contained artifacts but no burials. And still other didn't contain any prehistoric finds. Much of what he recovered was new and unprecedented. In the spirit of the times, Marović proposed that the finds represented remains of a hitherto unknown Cetina culture, which he ascribed to the early Bronze Age. The comprehensive report of his excavations was eventually published in 1991. Marović was to Cetina a bit like what Diego de Landa was to the Maya. Without him, we would know very little about the 3rd millennium BC in the Eastern Adriatic. On the other hand, his work reflected the professional standards of the times, which means that we shall never know the answers to many crucial questions about the Cetina mounds. Marović's excavation techniques were rough, and his documentation limited and sometimes ambiguous or vague. He dug at an extremely rapid pace. On the average, 1 or 2 small mounds were excavated each day, while the largest ones took about a week to dismantle. All of those mounds are now gone without a trace, and the photo that I keep showing you, this one, is a group of similar, relatively large prehistoric mounds, which is located farther to the southeast in the neighboring Herzegovina. In some mounds, Marović found stone cists containing inhumations in a crouched position. In other mounds, there were ashes and fragments of cremated human bones scattered across the mantle. In still other mounds, there was no trace of human remains. These are the kinds of objects that Marović found in the mounds. Most of them were recovered from the mantles of the mounds, where they were haphazardly mixed together. They included Cetina-style pottery, mostly fragments, which were sometimes refittable to complete vessels, Ljubljana Adriatic-style pottery, usually only a few isolated fragments, and also fragments of later Bronze Age pottery. Finds other than pottery were extremely rare and included a small flat copper dagger, a bronze battle axe, well, this one definitely is a battle axe, a bronze herring, fragments of a wrist guard, 2 fragments of a groundstone axis, and a shirt blade. With very few exceptions, these objects could not be linked to a specific inhumation or specific cremation burial. Marović based his definition of Cetina culture on those finds and on similar finds from other mounds within the region. He included a number of bronze weapons, many of them chance finds pillaged from mounds. Assuming that each mound represented a relatively short time span, Marović split the Cetina culture into 3 different chronological phases, but his oversimplified perception of the mounds became a source of dilemmas and misunderstandings. It soon became clear that many of the mounds were used and modified for centuries. This was suggested already by the careful revision of Marović's own published data and was verified over the last 2 decades through the employment of more sophisticated techniques of excavation, recording, and analysis. It is now clear that the prehistoric finds from the mounds in and around Cetina River Valley cover large parts of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, and possibly even later times. Only some of those mounds contain the characteristic Cetina-style pottery, which is restricted to a much shorter time span. As a consequence, referring to all of these mounds around the Cetina River as Cetina mounds is seriously misleading. The readily recognizable Cetina-style pottery actually constitutes only a very small but very characteristic fraction of the pottery assemblage. Common vessel shapes include open bowls and beakers, which sometimes are pedestaled. They are often richly decorated by incised and impressed geometric motifs that probably were filled with white paste for enhanced effect. Thank you. But usually this incrustation has not been preserved, it was washed out. Cetina, however, was not the first incised, impressed, and encrusted pottery in the region. It was preceded by the Ljubljana Adriatic pottery, which was different. It had different vessel shapes and decorative patterns, although both styles share a number of common traits. Ljubljana Adriatic style marks a clear break with the Neolithic potting tradition, which occurred around year 3000 BC. Highly decorated Cetina vessels probably were not made for quotidian purposes. They are relatively small and look like drinking sets, although some of the pedestal beakers clearly couldn't have been used as drinking vessels because they have perforated shoulders. We can only speculate that they may have been used in ceremonies or rituals, possibly related to mortuary practices. For the moment, the Cetina pottery style cannot be split into chronological phases. There are too few reliable associations, sound stratified contexts, or chronometric dates. The one possible exception might be this kind of characteristically decorated white beaker with two opposing handles, and there is some slight evidence that they are a late Cetina hallmark. The Cetina beakers are clearly not bell beakers, but a number of stylistic and functional similarities between the bell beaker, Ljubljana Adriatic, and Cetina pottery and pottery assemblages has been noticed and has been discussed sometimes in detail and often enough. At this point, one should also note that Cetina pottery is sometimes associated with archery equipment, such as small bifacial points made of flaked chert, quite a number of different types and shapes, as well as these transversal points. And also, sometimes there are stone wrist guards that are highly reminiscent of their bell beaker counterparts. Absolute dating of these incised, impressed, and encrusted pottery styles is still very shaky. Traditional cross-dating with the aid of characteristic weapons and ornaments made of metal is notoriously unreliable, and in our case, it is additionally compromised by questionable associations. Radiocarbon dates are few and also quite problematic. Altogether, less than 20 radiocarbon dates can be associated more or less convincingly either with Cetina or with Ljubljana Adriatic pottery. Several refer to contexts that contained both kinds of pottery, maybe because the two styles overlapped in time around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, but more likely because those contexts were disturbed and contained finds that were not contemporaneous. Many of the dates were obtained from long-life samples by the old beta counting method, and they have a large standard deviations. As a result, the best one can say is that the Ljubljana Adriatic style probably covers most of the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, while Cetina style covers the second half of the 3rd millennium and the very beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. But what do we know about the people behind the Cetina pottery? We know that they buried their dead in mounds. Or do we really know that? One of the time-honored truths, quote unquote, about Cetina is that both cremation and inhumation were practiced by those people. However, virtually none of the inhumation burials in stone cists, or for that matter any other inhumation burials, were accompanied by Cetina-style vessels. Bronze weapons and Bronze Age vessels found in some of those cist burials, as well as a few directly dated human bones, all point to a later period. Apparently, most of the inhumation burials in the Cetina heartland date from the post-Cetina times. Either they were inserted into the already existing mounds, or new mounds were erected above them. On the other hand, a number of mounds that contained substantial amounts of Cetina pottery also contained cremated human remains. Both were usually scattered across the mantle. Those mounds rarely contained any weapons, and when they did, the weapons were of a quite different kind compared to those from the cist inhumation. They included small flat copper daggers, ground stone battle axes, if they are battle axes or ground stone axes in any case, and wrist guards. Sometimes the ashes were concentrated in a few clusters or contained in small stone-lined depressions. Unfortunately, none of those created remains underwent bioarchaeological analysis, so we don't know if they represented single or multiple individuals, nor do we know anything about the demography, diet, health, biological ancestry of the people to whom they belonged. These Cetina mounds may be seen then as either individual or communal burial monuments. But those are not the only possible interpretations, as we heard already today, earlier in the morning. Maybe these mounds were not primarily burial monuments at all. Maybe they functioned as ritual foci of a different sort, only obliquely related to death and burial. The ritual that was practiced there may have required occasional deposition of cremated human remains. This last hypothesis gains some traction from the fact that there are mounds that contain lots of broken Cetina pottery, but no trace of human remains. Where did the people from Cetina mounds live? Information about settlements from the second half of the 3rd millennium BC is so scarce as if those people didn't live at all, but they just died and got buried. The erosional karstic environment may be partially to blame for this unfortunate situation, but another reason must be the lack of systematic research. So far, only 8 open-air sites in the Cetina heartland yielded more or less characteristic Cetina-style pottery. In each case, just a few Cetina portraits were either collected from the surface or discovered from small-scale excavations that revealed very little about the character of the site. Among those sites are several naturally defensible hilltop locations, like the one seen here in the background of this photo. Such hill forts were often fortified in later Bronze Age, but there is no evidence that any would have been fortified already in Cetina times. In a karstic region, caves make up, to some extent at least, to what on the surface has been lost to erosion, because they sometimes provide perfect sediment traps. Cetina-style pottery was reported from 15 caves in the Cetina heartland and from 10 caves in the Trieste karst and Istria. This suggests that caves were regularly frequented during the Cetina times. But frustratingly, Cetina finds tend to be sparingly sprinkled about at or near the present-day soil surface above the often thick Neolithic and Eneolithic layers. While those earlier sediments usually consist of finely stratified stabling deposits, the overlying Cetina and later layers tend to be disturbed and reworked. One is tempted to say that the Cetina visitors probably kept their herds in the caves, simply because that's what people did most of the time since the beginning of the Neolithic and up to until yesterday. But we actually have little hard evidence for Cetina herders, and it seems that something changed around their time in the way that the caves were used. We know even less about crop cultivation and how Cetina agriculture may have differed from what preceded it or what came after it. What can be said about the social organization of those communities? There is surprisingly little evidence of social ranking. No trace of central places or site hierarchy, no fortifications, and only limited evidence of warfare, nor clear examples of prominent individual burials. The Cetina mounds with broken and scattered pottery, intermixed with ashes, seem to point to social leveling rather than to individual prominence, especially if it turns out that the ashes represented commingled remains of many cremated individuals. That would make the mounds communal burial monuments. This is even more remarkable because in the immediate neighborhood, and even in the Cetina hinterland, Cetina heartland, there is striking evidence of exalted individual status that precedes Cetina by several centuries. Towards the southeast, the richly equipped mound burials of coastal Montenegro belong to the very beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. They are individual inhumations accompanied with weapons and ornaments made of gold, silver, copper, bronze, and ground stone. A couple of roughly contemporaneous and quite spectacular chance finds are known from the Cetina heartland itself. A set of sheet gold ornaments, biconical beads, buttons and armbands from Privlaka, and a copper battle axe with solid metal handle, a bronze dagger, and a groundstone axe from Ivankovača. Unfortunately, we know nothing about their contexts apart from the fact that at least one of them, and possibly both, came from mounds. Nothing remotely similar is known from the several centuries younger Cetina contexts. In this presentation, I have often referred to the Cetina heartland. So where exactly is that heartland? The sites that yielded Cetina pottery are fairly densely scattered across the middle part of the eastern Adriatic coast, islands, and hinterland. The closest cluster of site is located around the source of the Cetina River. Probably this is just a research bias, a consequence of the fact that that is where Marović carried out most of his seminal work. But it seems, nevertheless, that Cetina was rooted primarily in the hinterland. Cetina finds are not particularly dense along the coast, and they are relatively scarce on the islands. Interestingly, none of the finds from the islands were recovered from mounds, which otherwise abound there. There is hundreds of mounds, thousands of mounds on the islands. But only a few of those mounds have been excavated, so the relative scarcity of Cetina coastal and insular finds and sites might be just another research bias. On the other hand, a well-known and striking characteristic of Cetina pottery style is its wide geographic dispersal. Cetina style spread from its heartland, both overland and across the sea, but its maritime dispersal is particularly impressive. This is where the term Cetina phenomenon comes into play. One of the strangest places where considerable quantities of Cetina potsherds turned up is the tiny islet of Palagruža, located smack in the middle of the Adriatic Sea. But how does this apparent Cetina's maritime orientation and long-distance navigation square with the presumed hinterland core area? The upper course of Cetina River presents a very different natural environment and is pretty far away from the coast, and it is hard to imagine that the people who lived there were accomplished seafarers. So who was primarily responsible for the dispersal of Cetina style to distant destinations? The people who made and used the original Cetina pottery, or some sort of intermediary communities or agents, or maybe travelers from distant lands who occasionally came in contact with them. One should note that Cetina style finds from the overseas, while slowly accumulating in number, are still pretty few and far between. Some were recovered from burials, but none were recovered from burial mounds. Others were found in caves or in settlements. A few of those finds look like direct imports from the Cetina heartland, such as this vessel from La Terza, although that assumption should be tested by material analysis. Other examples, like this one from Olympia, are most likely local products that closely resemble the original Cetina. They look as if they were made by someone who knew Cetina pottery firsthand and decided to make some similar pots with slight twists in technology, shaping, and decoration. Still other examples, for instance this one from Malta, looks as if they were made by someone who only heard about Cetina pottery and produced something that he thought resembled it. This last example makes me think of the exotic animals from the 18th century natural history books drawn by the artists who never actually saw the animals. The obvious question is, why was Cetina pottery so important to be desired and emulated by someone living so far away from the place of its origin? The fact that it was used in ceremonial or ritual contexts doesn't sound like a sufficient reason. It's been argued often enough that in the 3rd millennium BC central Mediterranean, the sea was becoming the main avenue of long-distance interaction and travel. It may be that in Cetina times, traveling to faraway lands was prerequisite for social reproduction, in which case the exotic items would have represented the highly valued proofs of successful expeditions. But then, why are we not seeing more exotic items traveling in the opposite direction, towards the Cetina heartland? It is a bit perplexing that there is more evidence for ostentatious behavior, individual aggrandizement, and imported exotics during the period that preceded Cetina, those things that I just showed you briefly before. But the Ljubljana Adriatic-style pottery from that earlier period didn't travel nearly as far as did the later Cetina-style pottery. Nobody has found Ljubljana Adriatic pottery overseas yet, neither in Italy, nor in Western Greece, nor in Malta. If we decide to stick for now with the currently preferred term Cetina phenomenon, what would be the actual building blocks of that entity? For me, first and foremost, they would include the communities, let's call them Cetina communities, that inhabited a strategic geographic region along the eastern Adriatic littoral in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. We know that they built mounds, that they did some very strange things with the remains of their dead, and aside from that, we know very little. Their homeland was a diverse landscape of intertwined coasts, highlands, and islands, which allowed access to different interaction networks. Towards the west, the networks linking various bell beaker groups. Towards the southeast, the networks linking the Ionian Greece to the Aegean and beyond. And to the northeast, the networks linking different developments in southeastern continental Europe. Cetina communities participated in all those networks. Their participation is attested by the readily recognizable Cetina-style pottery that sometimes appears in unexpected faraway places. As succinctly put by Maja Gori, Cetina phenomenon is a widespread pattern of interconnections traceable through a particular ceramic style. But most of the details of those interconnections and the forces that drove them remain unresolved. We are swamped with questions and have very little answers, but that is where Cetina research is right now, still at the beginning.